Okay, so we're finally done with Jimmy Carter. And so to really understand what's about to happen next, I need to explain to you sort of the breakdown of liberalism and conservatism and how that has played out here at the end of the 1970s. So you remember I said, when Nixon was impeached and then resigned, that a lot of people said that was going to be the end and the death of the Republican Party, that we would now see a new political party turnover. And that very possibly could have happened. But what ends up happening is quite the opposite. The Republican Party is going to come back stronger than ever here, and it's sort of a perfect storm of events that lead up to that and allow that to happen with Ronald Reagan's election. So first, let's explain what liberals are and what conservatives are. So by the time we get to the 1970s, liberals are typically Democrats and conservatives are typically Republicans. That doesn't mean always, it just means usually. I also don't want you to associate any region of the country with Democrats or Republicans or liberals or conservatives, because we've got liberals everywhere and we've got conservatives everywhere. Really, you should associate it with the beliefs and not sort of like the region of the U.S. So let's talk about liberals first. The term liberal, basically what this means in terms of politics is that they favor more government intervention. So historically speaking, Democrats favor, at least in the 20th century, they favor more government intervention. That's something that liberals believe in. So they essentially want the government to play a significant role in improving the lives of all Americans. They value social programs to help the elderly, the poor, unemployed. They are typically the congressmen and the politicians who support legislation to benefit minorities and things like that. They usually favor government regulation of industry and business, so sort of a tighter hold on the economy. And they also typically, in terms of foreign policy, want to cooperate with international and intergovernmental organizations such as the United Nations. Conservatives, the baseline belief there is the opposite, so less government intervention. So most conservatives believe that a large central government can endanger economic growth and individual choice and freedoms, so they are fearful of having a government that is too powerful and too strong. Now, conservatives in the 70s had been very critical of liberal spending policies in the 60s and 70s that had left us with a very high inflation, higher taxes, and far too much waste. And by waste, I mean we're spending money on things that we don't necessarily need to be spending money on, or we're spending too much money on certain things. So they criticize liberals for simply throwing money at a problem to solve it. It's like, oh, here's poor people, let's just give them more money. Or, oh, here's a disenfranchised minority, let's just throw more money at this, instead of working through an actual long-term solution. So in the midst of all of this, we're going to see 4 new factions start to emerge in the United States that reflect conservative beliefs, and they will all basically slowly gravitate towards the Republican Party, helping the Republicans to make that comeback in 1980. The first are neocons. So neo means new, and con is just short for conservative. So this literally means new conservative. But it's sort of opposite. In reality, neocons are traditionalists, so sort of old school. So neocons warn about abandoning traditional values, getting away from the original structure of the Constitution and Bill of Rights and things like that. They talked about the quality of our youth that was declining. We've got children growing up in a very different environment in the 1970s than we ever have before, and we're not always sure how to combat the problems that our kids were growing up with. And a lot of neocons have their religious beliefs coincide with their political beliefs, so that's not always the case. So I don't want you to necessarily think that neocon means Christian or means Christian fundamentalist. That's a different group. Now, they can be, it just doesn't necessarily mean that. The second faction are basically just anti-communists. Anti-communism was very high among conservatives. They fought against things like the SALT II Treaty under Gerald Ford and any other relaxed initiatives that involved the Soviet Union. because they didn't trust the Soviet Union. They thought that ending the Cold War and for the United States and ending communism and at least containing it should be our number one priority, and that we shouldn't be willing to limit our nuclear weapons production when we can't necessarily trust that the USSR will do the same. The third faction are called Sagebrush Rebels. So these are people who typically lived in Western states who thought the federal government controlled too much land in those states. Now, what you can see this map here. This shows the percentage of federal land that each state has in terms of total land state or state land area. And you can see why the East wouldn't really have that much of an issue with federal land. But here in the West, we've got some states that have so much federally owned land. It's just crazy. Oh, sorry. So what they want is to have that land given back to the states so they can use it for economic development, whether that means it's privately sold or the state can use it for their own construction projects and things like that. Now, obviously, things like this are going to be largely criticized by environmentalists, and environmentalists are typically liberal. So you see why Sagebrush Rebels would be more towards the conservative side. On top of this, this is just more, people wanting less federal government control, which is a conservative idea. The final faction is called the Moral Majority. So the Moral Majority is a group founded by Reverend Jerry Falwell, who is a televangelist, and they focus on fixing the decline of the American family. And this is a Christian fundamentalist group. So this entire group is based on Christian fundamentalist beliefs. I don't want you to think that Christianity always means fundamentalism. It does not often actually mean fundamentalism, but it does in this case. So they're going to oppose cases like Roe v. Wade, and Roe v. Wade, as you should know, was the case that legalized abortion in the United States. It also they oppose cases like Engel v. Vitale. If you've never heard of the case Engel v. Vitale, it is the Supreme Court case that took prayer out of schools. So things like that. They also really condemned the ERA because they said it would, break apart the American family. If you remember the arguments that you read when we were talking about the second wave of feminism, arguments from Phyllis Schlafly against the ERA, those were the same arguments that the Moral Majority made. They were also against the gay rights movement, which was just starting to gain some traction here. So they were founded in 1979. By 1980, only a year into their existence and life here, there were over 2 million registered voters who are members of the Moral Majority. This is a very, very large political power structure here. Now, in addition to these four new groups, we're seeing population trends in the South that we're seeing more and more people moving to the South, to the Sun Belt, and we're seeing more and more immigrants moving to the United States, typically settling in the South because they're crossing the southern border. So as the South increases in population, that means that they gain more political power in Congress, and the South is sort of doubled over, right, with the Bible Belt. So that's securing that Christian fundamentalist vote with more power. And on top of that, if you remember, Nixon's Southern strategy had secured the South for Republicans. So the South is pretty much going to go to Republicans now, and we've got that power, that conservative movement is spreading even more. In the 1940s and 50s, conservatives and liberals typically worked together, and bipartisanship was common. Bipartisanship just means both parties working together. That's really going to end in the 60s and 70s. This right here we call the New Right, and the New Right is going to begin in the late 70s. This is just this resurgence of the conservative movement. Liberalism was losing its appeal after that economic decline and stagflation, and we were continuously seeing foreign policy issues over the same thing. So we saw a lot of that with Jimmy Carter. So all of these groups, they're saying that we're spending too much money on social programs. The over-regulation of the government or of businesses is hurting American industry. And then we're also seeing something else called unfunded mandates that were a big topic. And unfunded mandates are something that the federal government requires but doesn't pay for. So an example, a lot of times we see unfunded mandates in education, Common Core, for example. Now you're probably wondering, how does Common Core cost money? Well, it costs money to train teachers in Common Core, resources to teach them about it, days to have professional development classes about it, people to research how it should be put in place, you have to pay for. So it's all of that basically is the federal government saying we have to do this, but the state has to figure out where the money to fund all of that is going to come from. So all of these people are going to come together and find this true conservative for the Republican Party to run, and that's going to be Ronald Reagan. So Ronald Reagan was originally from Illinois, and then later he moved to California to pursue an acting career. And he had a pretty steady career. He wasn't like an A-list celeb or anything like that, but he had a solid career. He did become the president of the Screen Actors Guild, a position previously held by John Wayne. So as his career started to slow down, he became a spokesperson for GE, General Electric, and he went on speaking tours, talking about the economy and big business and things like that. After that, he started getting more involved in politics. He became a Goldwater conservative. That means, he was a supporter of Barry Goldwater, who was sort of like a heavy hitter, a major Republican in the 1960s. And he started talking more about how the government regulation of businesses and industry was hurting the economy, and he started to talk about the dangers of communism. So he got really involved with Barry Goldwater's presidential campaign, and when that happened, he really won the respect of a lot of conservative politicians. So in 1966, he ran for the governor of California and won, and then finished strong there, and so decided to run for president in 1980, and he was ultimately the Republican pick. Now, the Democrats are going to choose to reelect and renominate their incumbent, Jimmy Carter. Now, the problem is that Jimmy Carter was a dingus, and everybody knew it, and it was really killing the Democratic Party, and Reagan was really good at capitalizing on that. He had this famous thing where he would ask people, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? If you're not better off now than you were 4 years ago, then, maybe we need a change in leadership. Like, was it worth having Jimmy Carter around if he's not actually improving your life? And unfortunately for Jimmy Carter, most people would answer that question with no in 1980, that their life wasn't better in 1980 than it had been in 1976. So the race was pretty tight up until they had their one and only debate, because Reagan was a very good communicator, and it showed very clearly in the debate. So the final electoral vote was 489 for Reagan and 49 for Carter. So it was just an electoral sweep almost. And this won't only happen in the presidential campaign that year. We'll see that this new conservative revolution reflected in the Senate and in the Senate races as well. The House of Representatives will still be controlled by the Democrats, but the Senate will be controlled by Republicans for the first time since 1955.